You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum.
Welcome to Precinct 444, the official podcast of the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm your host, Josh Bronson, Director of Education, Programs, and Visitor Experience. Today, we're diving into a critical conversation about collaboration, intelligence, sharing, and trust, three pillars that define modern community safety. Joining me is Chief Melissa Hyatt, who's retired from Baltimore County Police Department, among other places. A respected law enforcement leader known for her commitment to transparency and partnership. Together, we'll explore how public and private sectors can work hand in hand to strengthen security and build trust in the communities we serve. Welcome, Melissa. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So, Melissa, can you sort of start? I ask this question a lot when groups come through the museum, especially new recruits or just law enforcement tour groups. And in the training that I've conducted in the past, I always like to sort of start off with this question, especially when we're talking about topics like this today. Why did you get into policing? What is your why?
Well, my father did his career in the Baltimore City Police Department, and he was absolutely my hero. I lost him a little over 2 years ago. And literally, I was in awe when I was growing up watching him. And it's the only thing I ever wanted to do. My parents told me that they knew two things to be true as soon as I could speak. The first, they knew that I loved dogs. And the second was that they knew I wanted to become a police officer. As I continued to get older, and I think I really understood a little bit more what that meant, I really spent a lot of time focused on what we would probably, consider vulnerable populations. I spent a lot of my middle school years volunteering at nursing homes, visiting some senior citizens that didn't have local families visiting. I volunteered frequently with Special Olympics Maryland, supporting athletes with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I spent many years volunteering for the Baltimore Humane Society with, shelter animals. So I think that really always fueled my eagerness to actually get started in the profession, really protecting those vulnerable populations from people that you would consider bullies or predators. It was just always very important to me.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I'm always fascinated in the why of why people go into a profession, that is so dangerous. But it really, I think, says a lot about who goes into the profession, because by and large, at the end of the day, the answers I always get back from people are because I wanted to help people. I wanted to, protect my community, or, things along the lines of what you just said, being involved in the community, family, being in law enforcement, all of these sorts of things. And I think it's always really comforting to know that, people go into policing for noble reasons, I think.
I agree with you. And I think this is such a difficult time, difficult moment that we're in. But the reality is that the majority of the people that commit their lives to public safety as a profession are just so committed to it and to trying to do the right things and to try to help the communities they serve.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the communities, because obviously communities are diverse groups of people, of stakeholders, there are, public stakeholders or private stakeholders. And especially as a chief, you have to manage relationships with all of those. And it's important to work with everyone in a community. No matter how difficult it can be at times. And so I'm sort of curious about the public and private partnerships, and just how they're so essential in today's modern policing environment. How do you manage some of those relationships, and why are they important to manage?
I think that these relationships have always been important. I think in today's environment, they're even more so. And when many of us came in this profession, there were so many sworn law enforcement officers, whether you were talking about local, state, or federal, that there really weren't very many events or incidents or issues that we couldn't handle as a profession. And now the reality is that there are a lot of resource and staffing challenges that have changed that narrative. And public safety can just no longer be the sole responsibility of those in sworn law enforcement. Realistically, looking forward into the future, I don't see that paradigm changing significantly. And it's going to need to continue to be a collaborative effort between, sworn law enforcement, those public entities, along with private. And when we say private, we're not necessarily just talking about corporations. Of course, we are speaking about them, but we're talking about, everyone from grassroots community groups to houses of worship, NGOs. There are limitless examples of what constitutes a private partnership. I think now more than ever, we have to continue to work smarter and not harder and collaborate more because our resources have dictated that that's what we need to do.
That's a really interesting point too, that, when people think of private, I think, they do tend to focus on one aspect, but, you talk about religious institutions and, schools and, all of these things that, are, increasingly we've seen under threat of, some kind. It's not to say that it's a new sort of environment. There've always been attacks on religious institutions and things, but, I am curious, just in how we've seen at least an uptick in certain spaces around, attacks on, in particular, religious institutions. But across the board, law enforcement has access to a huge amount of intelligence, certainly, from all different places, from, federal government and partnerships there to intelligence that they generate on their own or share within different agencies. How does it work then, though, when you have to work with some of those more private type entities with sharing that intelligence? And, you can't always share the exact intelligence, right? But you have to, they have to be able to trust that what you're doing is based on some real good information that you've generated to help protect them.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it continues to be a significant challenge when we talk about sharing intelligence or even just information across some of our sectors. And the reality is that trust and transparency continue to be major challenges. Those of us in sworn law enforcement have been told since, our beginnings and training that you really keep information close to the vest. You don't share it outside of the circle. A lot of that is cultural. Some of it is experience-based. But we also know that sometimes this can create silos. And there are times that crucial information doesn't get to the people that need it the most. Now, there are certainly other times that information should not be shared, right? And you referenced that. But it's also important to make efforts when possible to reduce information to a format that we can proactively share something with our safety partners. The goal with this is to have them help us keep the community safe. The other challenge that I see, and I've heard this on more than one occasion in several different organizations that I've been in, is, there's the mantra, if you see something, say something. And I've had more than one group, from community groups to other law enforcement agencies, say, you're asking for information, but you're not providing information back. And I think it's very important to also consider for those in the law enforcement community, actively in law enforcement, that while it's crucial to solicit this information from communities and other stakeholders, it's also really important to recognize the fact that they're going to be more willing to continue to provide that information and continue to be a good partner if they see that being reciprocated, and if it feels like they are also getting information to be able to disseminate to their communities. It helps them build their own credibility and really builds trust in the relationship.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that trust, in a community with law enforcement, it's so important. And, we see it over and over again where, we build up trust in an agency and then something happens somewhere else in the country. And, it erodes that trust that all that good work that we've done, potentially in that agency. Or, maybe it happens more locally, but, it it's such a difficult environment to build and maintain that trust, I think, in policing right now. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And, we continue to have these positive encounters, and we build these strong relationships, and that gives us the ability to put credits in the bank. One incident that occurs locally doesn't just necessarily have a local impact. It has implications and can have a significant long-term impact on communities across the country and even across the world. And that's something that we always have to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you walk us through a successful example of collaboration that improves safety outcomes for in your experience? And, perhaps it's a large scale type event, where you had to work with partners across sectors, both public and private.
The first situation that comes to mind for me, and this one was so significant, was the first Baltimore Marathon that we hosted after the Route 91 Harvest Festival
Mm,
shooting in Las Vegas. And
mm,
that was, I believe, 2017. And the Baltimore Marathon for us was in October every year. And in that particular year, it was literally days later. And of course, understandably, all of the partners were on edge. It had been, significant. And as we continued to adapt and evolve our plans based on that information, it was just one of those things that of course keeps you up at night. And this was an opportunity for us in the Baltimore City Police Department where we really pulled in our non-law enforcement partners more than we ever had before. And I think the piece that was so significant for me personally, as incident commander for that event, was we sent out information briefing not just our sworn law enforcement partners and not even just our non-sworn security officers, but we provided information to parking attendants, to Department of Transportation, to fire department, to so many other individuals that we perhaps hadn't had as much of an information share with before. And I remember on that day, we received information from a parking attendant about a person that was carrying what ended up being a weapon. And there was a very good exchange of detailed information that was quickly provided to law enforcement. We were able to get boots on the ground, get people out there. We were able to mitigate the issue. And that same day, we also got some significant information from someone that was working locally for our Department of Transportation. And again, that was information that got passed on to the command post quickly. So it was able to get disseminated and then dealt with. And while that day it was a successful marathon, and of course, a lot of people put a lot of effort into making that happen. So I was very proud of it. I was actually proudest of the fact that we had people that were not part of the sworn law enforcement community that felt comfortable enough, that felt valued enough, that they were willing to have a voice and they were willing to share information without, fear of what if I have this information wrong? What if somebody doesn't want to hear from me? They felt very comfortable doing it. And I felt it was because we had fostered that type of environment. And I never forgot about that because for me, out of, the dozens and dozens of large scale special events that I was incident commander for during my tenure in the Baltimore Police Department, that one for me, because of the results that we had with non-law enforcement individuals who had the same commitment to us to keeping the community safe and having a successful event, I never forgot about that.
Well, and I think that's such a good and powerful example too, right? Because we tell people, especially in the public, if you see something, say something all the time, right? And to your point, and it's so hard for people to actually then report something because they don't want to feel like they're getting involved in a situation that they just don't understand, or they talk themselves out of, am I really seeing what I'm actually seeing, or whatever the case might be. But over and over and over again, it's the public and that relationship that's built that actually prevents a lot of these mass, potential, mass large scale incidents from occurring in the first place. And obviously it's the hard work of law enforcement then on the back end to investigate and track down leads and things like that. But it all starts with that, the public, and feeling comfortable, coming forward that they're going to be believed.
You're right, Josh. I think they have to feel comfortable coming forward. There have to be avenues that are created to make it easy for them to come forward, for the information to directly get to the places where it needs to go. And, a lot of that then falls back on relationships and communication. And when those things are there, when the trust is there, people are more willing to take that risk to provide information when, you're right, they recognize they might not fully understand the circumstances, but this thing that they've observed or that they have information on doesn't feel right. And they want to make sure that they can send that information to the people that need to investigate it.
And we see that a lot in higher ed and in K through 12 schools as well, where, it's preventing school shootings and, things like that. It really comes down to the students being in tune with what is going on in a particular environment, their particular environment, and feeling comfortable coming forward. And it's even heightened, obviously, because they're young and, peer pressure and all of those sorts of things too. And those are some of the things, though. There's the averted school violence database, for example, where, learning about how shootings were prevented, how school violence was prevented, and things like that. That comes to mind with some of the things that you're talking about is learning from those successful averted attacks. However big or small, right? They might have been, but learning from our experiences, I think, is so important and something we're doing a much better job at now.
I agree with you. And I think it is so helpful that we're in a space now that we are looking at those successes instead of just kind of continuing to move forward and just say, "Ooh, we got past that one,"
Yeah.
because there are always lessons to be learned. There are always after actions, even with situations that end well or
Mhm.
have a positive outcome. There's always something that we might look at, reflect on, and say, well, maybe we could do this a little bit differently or a little bit better next time. And then that helps just make us stronger for the next one.
Well, and I think that's something, it's sort of funny too, because obviously there's always a good-natured competition of sorts between, like, policing and the fire department, sort of, and some of it's stereotypical, but there's a lot of truth in, in some of those good-natured competitions, competitive nature and things. But one of the things that, and I point this out over and over again to groups, especially younger officers and trainees, is that one of the things that the fire service does better than anybody has been those sort of after action, learning from not only mistakes that were made, but also from positive outcomes, to your point, and implementing, how can we prevent loss of life, loss of, structure, loss of firefighter injury and fatality, all of these things based on successes as well. And I think that's something that we are finally doing, much better on the policing side of things.
And I think that's such an important point because one of the big pieces that fire has been realistically decades ahead of police with is the use of instant command system. And anybody that
Mhm.
knows me knows that everything for me is ICS. And when you even talk about that after action, that's a component on the back end of the entire process. And I think whether it is effectively doing that after action or it's all of the planning pieces that are in place, that ICS is so very important. And I actually learned a lot of my own lessons on adopting ICS from Baltimore City's fire department. And I feel really fortunate. I know that there are a lot of jurisdictions where there is strong competition and sometimes not always the greatest relationships between police and fire. But we were incredibly fortunate in Baltimore that our police, our fire, our Office of Emergency Management were in lockstep. And even back in 2015, during the unrest after the death of Freddie Gray, we relied on each other so heavily. And I remain close to many of them. When I became a police chief back in 2019, my chief of staff was actually someone who was very senior in the Baltimore City Fire Department. We had worked so closely together on so many critical incidents that the level of trust between us was incredibly strong. And who better to have next to me helping me navigate a new position?
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. And those partnerships are, they develop, they become people that you definitely rely on. So that's fantastic. Switching gears a little bit, but staying in the same conversation and going back to something I mentioned before, one of the things that we've seen, and again, it might not necessarily be that it's just more of, there's definitely more, that we see, that we hear about. There definitely has been a rise of an increase in, things like anti-Semitism and Muslim sentiment and, just different. And we've even seen, attacks on Christian churches and things recently too. So, one of the things I think it would be interesting to sort of hear from you on and discuss is, securing houses of worship, securing those religious institutions, and campuses in some places, but what strategies have you seen work best in creating safety plans around securing houses of worship and working with community members in particular religious spaces?
Well, I think in context to this conversation, the most important piece is working collaboratively. That goes back to our conversation about relationships, about the need to build trust. So that's something that's really important. And, we always hear the old adage about not giving out business cards during a crisis. Those relationships really need to be formed with these houses of worship, private schools, religious schools, all of these other entities prior to a crisis happening. Many of them do need assistance as it pertains to their security planning, but they have limited resources. Many of these places don't have a significant pool of financial resources to be able to, add in every single camera and piece of technology that we know would be ideal for them to have. So one of the things that I've learned personally is that it's important to meet them where they are. It's important to find out what they have the ability to either dedicate or utilize, and then work together to develop and then implement common sense solutions together. Because if they're not common sense solutions that they can implement, or it's not strategies that their employees and their personnel are going to be able to continue to support and carry forward, then the strategies are going to not be successful. And the goal is to help them be as safe as they can. And that might mean doing some of these things, but not all of them, to make themselves a bit more of a harder target, a bit safer. And hopefully, as resources become available, there are more and more things they can do. A lot of times there are policies that are in place that might be effective policies, but simply aren't being implemented properly. There hasn't been training, there haven't been drills. So there are a lot of things that I consider to be low-hanging fruit to be able to help some of these partners strengthen from where they are to where they want to go. As we know, law enforcement frequently assists with assessments and developing plans, many times working together with training or joint training. And those partnerships really matter, getting police officers into, for example, these houses of worship, letting them go through and see the layout. Law enforcement always appreciates having extra places to train. And this also provides the ability to have some communication, possibly do a safety presentation, and really start to build that trust. When I was in the Baltimore Police Department, we completely revised how we handled the Jewish high holidays due to the evolving threat picture. And the Baltimore City is directly adjacent to Baltimore County. So there is a large Orthodox Jewish population that essentially straddles both jurisdictions. So eventually I became the police chief in Baltimore County, the jurisdiction right next door. And when I got there, we quickly realized that there was a lot of opportunity to bring Baltimore County's response to the point that Baltimore City had evolved to. And, now both sides of the border work very closely together in that community to help planning and deployment in and around those holidays. And the police departments, both of them and the communities, work very closely together every year to plan for those holidays and continue to update their strategies as they need to. And that's really what the goal is, to have those relationships, to work together, to continue to evolve as you need to, but to make sure that communication is there, because it's just so important.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. Open now, without warning, Ending the Terror of the DC Snipers is the museum's latest exhibit that immerses visitors in those haunting weeks and the extraordinary investigation that followed. See the modified Chevy Caprice used by the gunman, the rifle that terrorized the region, photos of the victims, and hear chilling 911 recordings. The exhibit captures the tension, uncertainty, and human costs of the attacks back in October of 2002. Get your tickets using the link in the episode description. And now, back to the show.
So, within certain communities and, since we're talking about houses of worship, with religious or religious communities, sometimes there is a mistrust of law enforcement. It's not just in religious communities, but others as well. So when there is that opportunity to collaborate with communities that might be hesitant to collaborate, how do you break through some of those barriers, and how do you get to be able to work with those communities to ensure safety? Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about, right?
It definitely is. And, the reality is that whether it's a community that's hesitant to collaborate or one that's comfortable doing so, those relationships matter. The trust of those community members matters. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not. And, I remember when I became police chief, and I'll start by saying that I will stand by being patient, being authentic, and just continuing to try. When I got in my position as chief, there had been some promises that had been made to several organizations before I arrived. And candidly, it placed me in a deficit because they felt they had been undermined prior to my arrival. And with one of those organizations that I met with regularly, it literally took me virtually getting punched in the face for almost 2 years of meetings where we just weren't communicating. There was no trust there on either side. It was clear that information that was, that I was providing, conversations I was trying to have, it just wasn't being received. It wasn't getting through. And it's frustrating, especially, when one of the things you pride yourself on is just being authentic and caring. And, here I am trying to facilitate this relationship and just struggling. And I just kept at it. And it literally took several years. And finally, one day in one of our recurring meetings, the president of this organization and I found common ground on a topic where there were several other people that were part of the meeting that didn't necessarily find ground. And we found ourselves, the two of us, very aligned in that moment. From that point forward, we actually had a separate meeting, just the two of us, and realized something that shocked us, that we actually had more in common than we did that divided us. And we're actually friends until this day. And I tell that story because it doesn't always work that way. I understand it doesn't. Sometimes relationships just don't work out. But what I found time and time again is just like relationships in our personal lives, if we continue to be patient and continue to just try to do the right things and be authentic, we all have a barometer to tell when somebody is being dishonest or not being their true selves. And sometimes we underestimate the fact that our communities have the exact same type of radar. And there are also times that we don't fully understand the landscape. I learned in that role not to take a lot of things personally, because oftentimes some of the issues that might exist between factions of a community and a police department have a long history that was long before your arrival as an executive, and that led to the current state that you're trying to do work to improve. And so it's just important to just keep trying. And I am really proud of the fact that we were able to make such progress on our relationship. And I will say from that point forward, not only did we begin to have open, candid conversation, but there were times that we brought them in to help us when we needed assistance, and other times that they brought us in to collaborate with them on other projects. And I'll always be glad that there was patience on both sides, and quite frankly, that we gave each other grace to continue to work on our relationship until we got into a place where there was trust that was built.
I love that because, sometimes, when people talk about, building trust within communities and, between communities and law enforcement, they present it as there's this magic solution that's going to fix all the problems and everything. And this is what worked. And sometimes it is just that like, you just got to keep trying. You just got to keep trying different things. Sometimes it's just that one thing that you agree on, like you said, and, it breaks down everything else. And I think sometimes we get so frustrated that nothing is working. And, at the end of the day, I think sometimes if we just remember back that at the end of the day, we all do want the same thing. We want to keep our community safe. And if we can start from a place of not assuming the worst of each other, I think
Exactly.
that's a huge part in that. Keep trying.
I couldn't agree more. And at the end of the day, we're all people, and under most circumstances, people are trying to do the right thing. But sometimes perspective is different, and we may be
Yeah.
coming at it with whether it's some type of history that the other person might not know about, or just not fully understanding each other's challenges. And once we have the ability to sit down and talk about them, then we can figure out a path forward.
Well, and to that point, misinformation, right? And the amount of misinformation, disinformation, false narratives, whatever you want to call it, there is so much out there, and it's not one political perspective or anything like that. There's just false information out there about everything from, a restaurant down the street, on a minor level, to much, obviously much more serious things. And that's got to be one of the biggest challenges right now as a leader in a police department is how do you navigate the amount of just false narratives out there, about everything.
Well, I think the reality with misinformation is that if we don't provide any information at all, we leave a vacuum, and that's
Mhm.
where the misinformation finds itself growing.
Mhm.
Honesty and dialogue have been the most important tools for me. And my communities, where both when I was in Baltimore City and in Baltimore County, knew when I could or when I couldn't share information. And if I couldn't share it, there was a reason that I couldn't, and that I would, as soon as I could, provide some level of information. There were also other times, I thinking about one incident where we had a situation that occurred involving one of our officers, and it was very concerning to the community based on some of the components of the incident itself. And while I couldn't speak publicly about it at the time, I was able to bring in a small group of people, a small group of stakeholders. I spoke to them. I shared some video with them that was not yet ready to be released. And ultimately, by bringing them in and speaking to them, answering questions, they became essentially third-party validators for the police department and for this police officer in particular, until we were in a space that we could say or do something more publicly. And it's so important to address false information, misinformation, by promoting accurate communication strategies. And you do that through, again, building trust, through leveraging partnerships to counter those narratives. And when I talk about third-party validators, sometimes we need people to help us share information that aren't wearing a uniform. And that's where a lot of these trusted community partners and other relationships really, really matter. And then there are other ways, right? There are formal processes. If we have a large scale special event, we may have a joint information center, a JIC stood up, or there may be other mechanisms, grassroots community networks that are pushing out information. There are a lot of different ways that this happens. There are a lot of different levels for doing it. But what's really important is when information can get clarified, to get it out there and get it out there accurately, and to always recognize if you make a decision not to share certain information, there is always the risk of that vacuum getting filled with misinformation. And if that is the case, making sure that you have the ability to rapidly work on addressing false information. And I mean, that's just not with us, with the communities we serve. When I was a police chief, I would frequently go to in-service training with my own employees and say, anybody have any questions? And somebody would ask me why I was doing something that I wasn't doing at all. Again, even in organizations, smaller organizations as well, there is misinformation. We have it in our own families. We have it in our own homes. So we know the importance of being as transparent as possible in dialogue, talking. The easiest way to dispel misinformation is by having a conversation. If there isn't communication occurring, you will not be able to know that there's misinformation out there, and you certainly won't be able to address it.
I think that's a great point in sort of contextualizing the conversation around false information, disinformation, is that it's not necessarily new, right? It's happened throughout, and of all different size agencies, and and putting it into that sort of context, I think helps to explain a lot of it. This is not a new phenomenon. We have it in our families, to your point, where, oh, I heard Aunt so and so is doing this, and it's like, no, that's not, that couldn't be further from the truth, right? And I think, and it's not, obviously the internet and social media have done some really great things, but I do think that the amplification aspect, that's probably the new part in all of this, right? Is just how amplified it is and how amped up people get based on what they see as truth. And that can be within our own agencies. It can also be, narratives in the community, certainly.
For sure. And, as I'm listening to you talking about this communication piece, I'm thinking about something that happened just a few weeks back in my own house. It was on Christmas night, and I was sitting having dinner with my husband, and I was all proud of myself. I'd made him a big dinner. And he's sitting eating and said to me, "Why do you make ham every year for me for Christmas? I really like turkey." And I said to him, "We've been married for over a decade, and you're just now telling me this." And it's right. It's the same thing. It happens to all of us. It's a human phenomenon of the fact that we have to be intentional with communication. And I just think it's important to remember that. And then to also remember that when we are in a crisis moment, that communication that's already really difficult for many of us, even in our personal lives, that's now amplified. And now it's even more important to be more intentional. And pertaining to misinformation, it must be clarified.
That Yeah, it's a perfect example, right? And it's about being transparent, right? And expecting that transparency on both sides, right? You being transparent and expecting transparency back, right? And
Yes.
having that open communication. And when it comes to transparency, we again, we I think we throw around words a lot. And you've touched on it a little bit already, but what does true transparency look like in practice?
Well, it's interesting because I've actually had the opportunity to see this on both sides. So I spent over 20 years in sworn law enforcement in the Baltimore Police Department, working closely with private sector partners, community partners. And then I moved into the private sector. I was vice president for security for Johns Hopkins Medicine University. And then after that, I returned to sworn policing as a police chief. When I was in sworn law enforcement the first time, we relied on private sector partners for everything from teaching our new foot patrol officers customer service. We had a corporation help us with that, to assist us with planning for large scale special events, giving us venues, different things like that. But candidly, it wasn't until I entered the private sector myself and realized what it was like to be on the other side of that. At that point, depending on a law enforcement response to assist us, it's a really different feeling. And I remember two different incidents. One, we had an armed person on a campus, another one where we had a carjacking. And it's a very vulnerable feeling when you're on that other side, when you're not part of sworn law enforcement, but you're relying on them. And one of the situations went perfectly well. The other one provided some opportunities for us to debrief and improve, and we did. But I couldn't always see things in that same way when I was sworn. I didn't really fully appreciate the importance of that transparency, of having information shared, of, being able to pick up the phone and call someone. I had taken those things for granted. And when I returned back to being in uniform, I never forgot about that. And as we were dealing with planning any of our special events in Baltimore County or any of those other things, it was just a reminder of how important it is. And while being a police officer is a difficult and challenging job, when we're handling these types of crises or types of incident, or planning for types of incidents, it's actually so much easier to be in that sworn space, to have access to that intelligence, to have access to those resources, versus being in what I'm going to refer to as that private space, whatever that is, and having to rely on those resources coming to you. I remember after the unrest in Baltimore in 2015 that I had a meeting. I was chief of staff at the time and had a meeting with several large educational institutions that were telling us they were really upset that while the riots were occurring in Baltimore, they didn't feel like they had received some of the information they needed to. And they had international students, they had parents from around the world calling to say, where is this occurring? Where is my child? And they felt that they didn't have appropriate information. That was such a learning moment as well. Just that recognition that we have this information, but there are times that other people need it. And when we have the ability to help them also do their jobs better, and they're sharing back with us, not only is that ideal communication, but that's what transparency looks like. And where there are times that we can't share information, because they recognize the fact we've built that trust that we will share it when we can. And if we can't, there's a reason why we can't. They trust that. And I think that's really sometimes the best we can do, but it's an ideal state for me.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a great example too of, I love how, you're looking at it from both sides. You've had that experience of having been on sort of both sides of, of that sort of a, need for law enforcement response, but also being the law enforcement that is responding. And, those situations, they're the same situation, but it's just very different when you're on, when you're in law enforcement, you're a sworn officer and you're responding, you're used to dealing with that. right? Whatever that situation is, it might be a new situation, but you're used to dealing with crises, and situations that occur on the job. Whereas the person who's experiencing it might never have experienced that before. So they're relying on a certain level of response. And um, when you have that transparency built up, when you have that trust, those relationships, it makes all the difference in the world, because you automatically have a higher level of trust in that response then.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's interesting to kind of see both sides of that for sure.
It's just a lot going on in the world right now. But looking forward, from where you sit, what does the future look like for from where you sit, as far as community safety, collaboration, what do these things look like for you being a leader in the law enforcement space, and having that voice? What do you see the future looking like?
I think it's an exciting future. Things continue to evolve. We see technology evolving, the world's changing, and of course, it can be challenging in many ways. But I try to be a glass half full type of person, and I think there are a lot of really positive things out there. We have to continue to rely on our partners, just like they have to continue to rely on us. Right now, I am really proud that I am doing some work with Policing Lab, and their mission is to empower police departments through technical assistance and advanced technology and some other things. And they're doing it at no cost to these police departments. So there are several cities that have had the opportunity to work closely with them. And there are other entities that are out there that are doing work to assist sworn law enforcement, recognizing the fact that resources are limited, but that sometimes enhancing expertise provides the ability to work smarter and not harder. And since I hit on Policing Lab, one of the things that they launched in October was the PUG, the Police Unmanned Ground Vehicle.
Mm.
And really that is with under the same mantra of recognizing the fact that resources are limited. So freeing up officers to respond to those critical calls for service, and allowing them to spend time on the really important things that they need to be spending time on. As we continue to evolve into the future, and everything from enhanced technology, including AI, as we continue to do more work, this is another space where bringing in experts that want to provide assistance, many times really at low or no cost, continues to build our portfolio as a profession, make us smarter, make us faster, make us more effective, more efficient, instead of just having that siloed, we're the police and we'll do everything in-house ourselves. Even recently, I was doing some work with the Fairfax County Police Department, and it was literally the Saturday night before Christmas. It was freezing cold, and all of these community members came out to be role players for training for their CDU basic school. And it's just a reminder that even with all of the challenging things we see in the media, overwhelmingly, our communities support law enforcement. They want to help, they want to be part of solutions. And so it's really important to develop a strategy and to be intentional and to bring in some of these stakeholders where you can build those relationships. And then when there's a time that they need you and you need them, those relationships are established and you're both in a better, stronger place. And again, while some of the communities we serve may have a different perspective, and we may be looking at some of these situations differently, at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is safer communities and really these strong relationships to be able to work closely together. And I think the future is bright. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about the law enforcement officers that are being recruited, that are coming out of these academies. Training has advanced incredibly. We have more technology assisting them with training. We have equipment that keeps them safer. So that way, hopefully, we can reduce the number of injuries and deaths of our law enforcement officers. And I know these things are going to continue to be a focus into the future. And that's why when I look at the future of community safety and collaboration, I think it looks bright.
Well, that's a great response because I think it is important to highlight the positive and the positives that are happening, and the fact that a lot of times we focus on sort of the noise out there, and we don't actually focus on all those positive interactions that we do have on a regular basis. And I think by and large you're absolutely right. I mean, I think by and large our communities and our law enforcement do work well together, and we do all want the same thing, and I think it's important to highlight that and continue to not forget sort of what got us here, as far as building trust and working together, and I think I do think there's a lot of positive out there that we sometimes forget about. So I appreciate you being positive in your in your answer there about the future. So that's great.
Absolutely.
So, with that, I think that's probably a good place to stop for today. Hopefully we'll be able to have you back. I really appreciate you, and thank you for sharing your perspectives, your insights, your experiences with us today. The perspective that you brought on collaboration, communication, and trust, it's just invaluable, as we navigate the complexities of modern policing. For all our listeners, remember that community safety is a shared responsibility, and it's built through dialogue, transparency, and partnership. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to Precinct 444 and join us next time as we continue exploring the stories and strategies shaping law enforcement today. Until then, stay safe and stay connected.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.